Forget New Year, New You. This season is about slowing down, locking the doors, and cozying up at home with the one you really want to do nothing with. Your dog. After the holiday chaos, those quiet nights with a blanket, a podcast, and your pup feel like the reset you actually need. Ollie helps make those moments easier with fresh protein-packed meals made from real human-grade ingredients, so your dog can enjoy some quality comfort food too. Choose from 5 recipes and get a personalized plan for your dog's needs. Meals arrive perfectly proportioned with a scoop and storage container, so serving is fast and mess-free. And with Ollie's in-app on-demand health screenings, supporting your dog is easy, ensuring more cuddles for many years to come. Visit ollie.com/truecrime and use code TRUECRIME for 60% off your first box.
Early one spring morning, 32-year-old Venus Stewart was still dressed in her pajamas when she vanished into thin air from her parents' home in rural Michigan. She appeared to have just gone outside to get a package from the mailman. Police conducted multiple searches and kept coming up empty. The weeks and months dragged on. Community members gathered their dogs and walking sticks and marched in tall prairie grass, through empty fields and thick woods to search for her. Again, no sign of the missing mother of 2 young daughters. Cadaver dogs couldn't pick up a scent. More than 24 psychics even tried to use the vibrations, dreams, and feelings to provide supernatural help with the search. Nothing. Venus's family held regular prayer vigils. The largest newspaper in the area, the Kalamazoo Gazette, covered the story, which was drawing more and more attention as time went on. At the time, Rex Hall Jr. was the cops reporter at the Kalamazoo Gazette, covering the story when it broke in 2010.
When she disappeared, there were a lot of people from the community there in Colon and Colon Township that really rallied around her mom and dad, and wanted to find her. I guess even if it was going to be that they found her alive, or that they found her not alive. I think there was really definitely a sense that I can recall of the community wanting to help out and wanting to find her, because there was definitely a sense that amongst her family and friends, and probably even people there in the community, that they really loved her, and they were shocked that she was missing and shocked by the way that she had gone missing, and I think really wanted to help her family out.
There was no body, and although authorities quickly narrowed in on someone who had the means and a motive, they didn't necessarily have the opportunity. Venus's estranged husband, Doug Stewart, was singled out as a person of interest early on in the investigation. Venus's family was certain he was responsible. He took her. He took her. He took her. Venus's mother kept repeating when a trooper responded to the missing person call. However, Doug had an alibi. He wasn't even in the state of Michigan at the time. He was at home in Newport News, Virginia, on the day Venus disappeared. There seemed to be proof of that, too. Doug's credit card had been used at a fast food meal place in Virginia. His car was seen driving in his apartment complex, caught on camera. And he had paid a bill in person at a lawyer's office.
Once the details started to come out in terms of what police and the state police were able to piece together about what happened, you just had a lot of intricate things going on, and a couple of key players in the case that once the details came out, it was really all kind of shocking.
Today, we're covering this case based on public records from the Michigan Court of Appeals. What happened to Venus Stewart? This is Jillian, and you are listening to Court Junkie, episode 152. It was apparently love at first sight when Venus met Doug Stewart. They got married on their third date, was the way Doug told it during an interview with Dateline. But Venus and Doug's marriage wasn't always a happy one. Once Doug loses all control over me, he's going to hunt me down and kill me, Venus once wrote in a petition for a 2008 personal protection order, according to the Kalamazoo Gazette. Now that I don't have my parents to protect me, and if he finds out where I am, he's going to kill me. It's only a matter of time. She had almost divorced Doug in 2009, but had called it off a month before the divorce was finalized. According to the Gazette, she didn't want to share custody and miss any time with her daughters. Above everything, Venus had always wanted to be a mom. But at the time of her disappearance, Venus was living apart from Doug. Doug, Venus, and their children had moved to Virginia as a family in 2009, but within months, Venus and the girls returned alone to Michigan in February 2010. Doug stayed in Virginia. Venus filed for temporary custody of the couple's two daughters. Then, on April 26, 2010, Venus disappeared from her parents' driveway in rural Colon, Michigan, which was in St. Joseph County near the Indiana border. Those who loved Venus described her as confident and strong-willed, according to the Gazette. Venus and her mother, Therese McComb, had an especially tight-knit bond. Venus would also do anything for her two children.
I remember the friends and family describing her as a really good mother who would do anything for her kids, and just a really good person with a big heart. And I think that's really, her mother, one of the things that I remember her saying was that Venus was her best friend. And so when this happened, it was like Teresa lost her best friend. And I think that all of those descriptions kind of, for me at the time, kind of painted the picture of someone who was, really loved because of the way and how well she treated others.
Clues left behind indicated a struggle, that something sinister might have happened at her parents' home. Venus's father, Larry McComb, noticed the gravel road had been disrupted. A pink hair tie lay on the sidewalk. And Larry remembered something else odd. Almost every night before bedtime, Doug called on the phone to talk to his daughters. The night before, Larry put Doug on speakerphone so everyone could hear him. Doug asked one of the girls a question that seemed out of place. Where does Frank, the McComb's Doberman, sleep? Furthermore, on April 26th, after Venus had been gone all day, Doug didn't call the girls that night. At first, Doug was willing to speak with the police. He talked to a detective on April 26th and said yes, he knew his wife was missing, but he had been in Virginia all day. He mentioned the places he had been, like his lawyer's office, as an alibi. The detective wanted to talk further and go over his whereabouts in more detail. Doug agreed. Then, the next day, Doug canceled. He refused to meet or let the detective search his truck, although authorities later obtained a search warrant anyway. Doug suggested maybe police contact Venus's friend who lived in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. His tip didn't appear to go anywhere. Police were still focused on him. The Michigan State Police, the lead agency on the case, got to work finding evidence. MSP Trooper Todd Peterson photographed tire impressions left on the road and the grass by Venus's parents' home. According to court documents, the tracks looped around before coming back onto the roadway. But before coming back to the roadway, the tracks indicate that the vehicle backed up, and there were footprints outside the tracks here, though since the tracks were in the grass, no impressions were visible. Trooper Peterson found a footwear impression near a woodpile in Venus's parents' yard. as well as a separate heel impression. Underneath a boat in the yard, he found a wrapper or packaging for a tarp. The words "Marketed by Walmart Stores Incorporated" appeared on the packaging. Venus's family said it didn't belong to them. They hadn't recently purchased a tarp. The items were sent to the crime lab for DNA testing. Meanwhile, neighbors and Venus's family members were talking to police. On April 25th, the day before Venus went missing, neighbors Lena Powell and Mark Thomason saw something strange. A man, soaking wet as if he had just jumped into a lake, standing by their fence. He wore an army coat. He asked for directions into the village of Colon. Then, April 26th, the morning Venus disappeared, neighbor Teresa Thompson remembered seeing a truck parked in a field across from her house. A man stood by the truck. He wore a baseball cap that was pulled low over his face. According to court documents, the fact that someone was in the field that early in the morning seemed suspicious to Ms. Thompson. She explained that she was home alone with her children, so she watched out her window for 10 or 15 minutes. Teresa's 12-year-old daughter recalled more details from that morning. It looked like a gray Chevy. The man seemed to be swaying back and forth, looking at the ground. When Teresa left her house at 7:15 a.m., the truck and the stranger were gone. Back at Venus's parents' house that day, Venus's teenage niece, who lived there too, remembered seeing Venus in the living room at 6:50 a.m. when she left to get on the school bus. At 8 a.m., Venus's dad woke up to the sound of Frank, their dog, barking. He went back to sleep, but 20 minutes later, his grandchildren, Venus's daughters, were playing loudly unsupervised. It wasn't like Venus to let her daughters be so noisy when not everyone in the house was up. A red flag rose in his mind. Larry was concerned enough that he got out of bed and soon began looking around the house and the yard for Venus, who was nowhere to be seen. Her keys, cell phone, purse, and everything else she owned was still inside the house. Larry sounded the alarm. He called 911 to report Venus missing, and then called his wife to come home from work, and then he went out to look for her. Brian Wages later contacted police with an unsettling tip. He couldn't remember which day exactly, but he had been driving one morning around Colon when he passed a vehicle with a Virginia license plate. Mr. Wages thought to himself, having friends from Virginia, that was such a long drive and the truck's occupants were weary travelers. When Mr. Wages passed the truck, the man turned his head and would not look at him. As he passed the truck, he saw a girl sitting in the front passenger seat with her head against the window. There was something that looked like a sleeping bag in the passenger seat as well, so he thought she was sleeping. The car was grayish blue, and Mr. Wages thought it might have been a Chrysler. On the evening of April 26th, Doug was recorded on his Virginia apartment surveillance system. He asked the assistant property manager if any police had called, requesting to see the surveillance footage. One of Doug's neighbors, James Weaver, noticed Doug was bruised and scratched. Visible marks were left on the former Marine's neck, forearm, and thighs. Newport News police assisted with the investigation, and after a search warrant was obtained, they searched Doug's Virginia apartment, which was near the beach and the woods, an area that seemed secluded. Officer Richard Gaddis secured cadaver dogs to look for a body in the area around Doug's apartment, but nothing was recovered. Investigators were still convinced that Doug was involved in his wife's disappearance. In fact, in June 2010, 2 months later, he was arrested and charged with her murder. But he couldn't be in two places at once. If he was the one responsible for kidnapping and even murdering Venus, then who was on surveillance video back at his apartment? The jury would find out at his trial just 8 months later. Doug's trial started in February 2011. He was charged with open murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree premeditated murder. The evidence against him was damning. Doug's fingerprint had been found on the tarp cover that had been recovered from Venus's parents' yard. Tire prints found near the scene matched the same manufacturer as the ones on Doug's truck. And a reddish stain was found inside Doug's truck, although it wasn't conclusively human blood. What was conclusive was a Walmart receipt from the floor of the truck. Listed on the receipt, gloves, a shovel, a hat, and a tarp. After presenting their evidence, now there was the task of tackling Doug's alibi. It was time to introduce someone to the jury. Ricky Spencer wasn't particularly remarkable. He was 21. He was a community college student who lived with his parents in Delaware. His parents described him as an impressionable young man and said he suffered from severe dyslexia. Ricky liked to play video games a lot. He befriended Doug Stewart through the gaming community, and the two began playing Xbox Live together for up to 10 hours a day. During the marathon video game sessions, they talked on the phone. Despite the 8-year age difference, Ricky considered Doug to be his best friend. A brother from another mother, Ricky testified. They had known each other for almost 2 years when Doug suggested they meet in person. He invited Ricky to spend spring break with him in Virginia in April 2010. Ricky would undoubtedly regret this spring break trip. He would go to jail because of it. In front of a jury in a St. Joseph County courtroom, Ricky recounted what happened as he testified against Doug in Doug's murder trial. He was the prosecution's star witness.
He did a really good job for the prosecution in terms of laying out what the entire plan was that he and Doug Stewart came up with. He seemed nervous when he testified. He seemed young, and he seemed kind of awkward on the stand. But I think that probably had something to do with his age, with whatever he had going on at the time.
According to Ricky, spring break started off innocently. They went to Busch Gardens theme park and tried to get into clubs. Of course, they played more video games in Doug's messy apartment that he kept while living on his own. The smell of the place bothered Ricky so much that he offered to clean it. Doug opened up to Ricky about his past. He told him that he was in the military, an elite sniper, and like a ninja, where he was able to take out people without anybody realizing someone was gone. Doug elaborated to Ricky, telling him he would come from behind and choke someone, or he would use weapons such as knives, according to state court documents. These secrets were leading up to something. Doug had something important to tell Ricky. He wanted to kill his wife, and Doug needed Ricky's help. "Why are you doing this? Because you're mad at her?" Ricky asked, according to his court testimony. And he said, "No, because my children are at stake." Doug claimed that Venus was mentally and physically abusing their girls. He insisted he had to take action. If he did nothing, Doug was scared Venus was going to kill or hurt their little girls. If that ever happened, then Doug would go on a rampage. According to documents, Doug also said that there was a good chance that he could get away with it, but he would always be under the radar, and then said that this is where Ricky came in. Ricky stated that Doug told him, "I want you to be my alibi. Pretend to be me and live in my apartment." Ricky told Doug no, and Doug didn't talk about it again that day. Doug wouldn't drop it, though. In the following days, Doug painted a picture of Venus as a violent mother. Doug told stories to Ricky. Like on Christmas 2008, he said he heard Venus slap one of the girls. "Daddy told me to do that to you," Venus had coldly said. Or at least that's what Doug said happened. There were bruises on one of the girls' backs. Venus told Doug she was going to blame it on him. Another time, Doug claimed Venus choked their other daughter. If Doug hadn't been there, he said Venus would have killed the little girl, who complained all day that her throat wouldn't stop hurting. Ricky heard Doug's stories that made Venus seem like a monster. Then, an apparent server showed up at Doug's apartment and gave him child services papers that made Doug upset. The state court documents don't indicate what the purpose was of the papers. Doug had Venus's murder all planned out. He was going to do this in the day while the children's grandparents would be at work and the children would be at school. Doug said that choking was the best way to kill someone without leaving any evidence, and he demonstrated by choking Ricky, according to state documents. Ricky said Doug then turned him around and demonstrated how he would do the choking, putting him in a headlock. Ricky felt scared, was out of breath, and could not scream when he was in the headlock.
You know, one of the things that really stuck out from the trial and the testimony that came out specifically from Ricky Spencer was he talked about when he and Doug were making the plan for Doug to kidnap and kill Venus Stewart, that Doug Stewart showed him some type of chokehold or move that you could do to render a person unconscious. And Ricky Spencer said at the time that basically Doug told him, if you do this chokehold for 10 seconds, the person goes unconscious. You do it for 30 seconds, they die.
Finally, Ricky agreed to help. He believed his friend. Venus must be a threat to the two children, Ricky thought. Ricky would cover for Doug by pretending to be him in Virginia, essentially giving Doug an alibi as his friend traveled to Michigan. This spring break trip that had taken an unexpected twist was over, and Ricky headed back home to Delaware on April 11th. Their plan was in motion. 4 days later, the two friends met at a Maryland mall, and Doug gave Ricky his credit card, all his keys, his sunglasses, his cell phone, plus a prepaid cell phone, some of Doug's clothes, and a paper with instructions written down. Ricky headed to Newport News to impersonate Doug. Doug left for Michigan. But their plan was thwarted. At 4:25 a.m. on April 16th, Doug was pulled over by an Ohio State trooper in a traffic stop. He was exhausted from driving straight through and was swerving on the road. He told the trooper he was on his way back in town for court since he and the missus were separated. Doug knew he had been discovered. The traffic stop had surely created a record or proof he was in the Midwest, not home in Virginia. Doug called the plan off and headed back east. Venus was safe, at least temporarily. According to Ricky's testimony, Doug seemed pissed off that the plan had failed, and Ricky recalled him saying, "There's gotta be a way," and "so close, so close." Ricky was relieved. When Doug began talking about trying again, Ricky told him he didn't want to, and it was a one-time deal. Doug began discussing going to the house and killing anyone who was there, except his daughters, instead of simply planning for Venus's disappearance. This upset Ricky, who then agreed to pose as Doug again for his alibi. Doug and Ricky waited a few days and then attempted their plan a second time on April 25th. Again, they met in Maryland to hand off everything Ricky would need to convince the world that he was Doug Stewart. Ricky had Doug's clothes down to his cell phone and apartment keys. Using Doug's credit card and his car, Ricky headed to Virginia and bought a meal at Wendy's. He then drove into Doug's apartment complex, which was recorded on a security camera, and went into Doug's apartment. Ricky, pretending to be Doug, called in sick to U.S. Foods where Doug worked. While he waited for word from Doug, Ricky played video games. He lied to his parents, telling them he was in Maryland doing homework with a friend. A day later, April 26th, Ricky got an update from Doug. "It's done," Doug said on the call. "How was it done?" Ricky asked. Doug confessed he had called the home of Venus's parents and pretended to be the mailman with a package to deliver. According to court documents, when Venus opened the door, Doug said he jumped out. She screamed once and he put her in a headlock. She struggled. A drop of blood fell from her nose onto the concrete where Doug had her in the headlock. Doug told Ricky he would call him back a little later. He was on his way to bury his wife. Doug didn't give Ricky details on where he planned to hide the body. Maybe in a national park where nobody would ever look. He said no one would know until he would eventually disclose the burial spot in his will. While on the phone with Doug, Ricky could see that Venus's parents were trying to call Doug's phone. By this time, the McCombs were frantically searching for Venus. Doug's alibi still had some work to do. Doug wanted Ricky to go to his Virginia lawyer's office and pay a $100 bill. The younger, smaller version of Doug, dressed in aviator glasses and a hoodie, and headed over to do as he was asked. The law office wasn't fooled. They had just seen the real Doug recently. Doug, older and bulkier, moved with the posture and the formality of someone who had been trained in the military. This new Doug didn't act that way.
Was it a good plan? No, I mean, I really don't think that his idea of having Ricky Spencer act as his imposter in the end, I don't think it was a great plan. They just didn't look a lot alike. In terms of the police being able to recognize that from the get-go, I don't know if they did, but obviously once they started to piece things together, I think when they looked at things like surveillance footage, it became clear to them that the person that you're looking at, in fact, was not Doug Stewart.
Law firm employee Colleen Bateman verified that someone came into the office and claimed to be Doug, though this man appeared to be a different type of person, she said. Ricky went to Wendy's again and bought another meal. He was getting tired of being an imposter. The charade was almost over. That evening, Ricky and Doug had their final rendezvous in Maryland. Ricky returned Doug's belongings and drove back home. The two men stayed in touch, though. Quote, Doug warned Ricky that the police might come to talk to him. If they did, Doug told Ricky to tell them that they never met. If he didn't, Doug told Ricky that he could be facing the same charges that he was, and he had never mentioned anything like that before. Ricky's revelations on the stand were winding down. He had made a deal with the prosecution to tell his side of the story. This greatly angered Venus's family, who thought it was unfair since Ricky had known that Doug was intending on killing Venus and yet did nothing to stop him. According to court documents, Ricky was testifying under a grant of immunity, and if he were ever charged in the future, it would be for manslaughter. This would fall under a plea agreement where the prosecutor would recommend a sentence of no more than 1 year in the county jail. Absent this plea promise, Ricky would be subject to a sentence of mandatory life. Evidence introduced at Doug's trial corroborated Ricky's story. A Michigan State Police intelligence analyst explained to the jury about cell phone towers and GPS data that detectives believed showed Doug and Ricky communicating with each other. The cell phone data, authorities said, also showed Doug traveling from Virginia to Michigan, with the stop at the Ohio Walmart to buy supplies.
I also remember the testimony of an employee at the Walmart in Ohio that they connected Doug Stewart to, where he bought the gloves and the tarp and the shovel prior to Venus's disappearance. And I remember that she talked about seeing Doug Stewart in that Walmart and how seeing him stuck with her, that there was something about him, something about his eyes that just really, she remembered him, even several months later, or even, almost a year later at that point in that courtroom, she remembered him and she ID'd him as being in that Walmart. And her testimony really stuck with me just because of how impacted she was by that one interaction she had with him in that store.
A cellular phone bought by Doug pinged off a tower by Venus's parents' home just after 7 a.m. on the morning of April 26th, according to court testimony. It fit with Ricky's story, how Doug claimed he called the home, pretending to be a delivery man with a package. Was Venus Stewart alive or dead? Her body still hadn't been found 10 months after her disappearance, as the trial came to a close. Venus's grandfather said somebody had called 2 weeks after Venus's disappearance, claiming to be Venus. The woman said she was in Chicago. The grandfather was hopeful at first that it was really her, but by the end of the call, his hope deflated. He testified he was convinced it was not her. A detective said there was no evidence that Venus was alive when he was asked on the stand. The court testimony from Venus's parents, Larry and Teresa, also confirmed Venus had disappeared, never to be heard from again.
Her mother's testimony was, and even listening to her father, had the two of them having to sit up there and kind of recount that day, but then also talking about, like the fact that they did talk to her every day, and they never heard from her again after April 26, 2010. And just, their pain and their grief, especially in that courtroom and when you're listening to the testimony in person, it was really palpable, I would say.
First up with his closing arguments was St. Joseph County Prosecutor John McDonough, who made news in 2008 when he was elected at age 28, making him one of the youngest prosecutors in the state of Michigan. The Doug Stewart case was among several high-profile trials early in his young career. The Kalamazoo Gazette reported what he told the jury. "I told you that Ricky Spencer would be the biggest piece of the puzzle. And he is," he said. "We would not be here today without Ricky Spencer. But the rest of the evidence are the smaller pieces that fit into the puzzle that create a very clear picture. The only piece that is missing is Venus Stewart's body. With one piece missing, you can still reasonably determine what the puzzle is that has been put together. I believe that puzzle proves beyond a reasonable doubt that Douglas Stewart is guilty of first-degree premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree premeditated murder." Next, it was the defense's turn. The whole trial was an illusion of evidence, Doug's attorney, Jeffrey Schroeder, said. He asked what evidence they have that demonstrates that Venus is dead. She's not around anymore? We don't know where she's at? Well, let's consider for a minute about what the forensic pathologist said in this case, about how Venus Stewart died and her autopsy. We don't have that because they don't have evidence that she is dead, he said.
In terms of Doug Stewart's defense team, one of the things that they really pointed out to the jury during that trial is that there is not a body. There has not been a body found. So, it's kind of to put that question out there of how do we even know that she's actually dead? What if she's alive? What if all of this is a big mistake? But the evidence, I think, in the end, it didn't show that, not one bit.
The jury didn't take long to deliberate, about 3 hours. The verdict, Doug Stewart was guilty. In the moment, Rex paid attention to both sides of the courtroom to see their reactions.
And I remember looking at Venus's family, but then keeping an eye on Doug because I wanted to see how he would respond. And there really wasn't. I mean, he kind of just sat pretty stoically with his attorneys. I remember that after the verdict was read, they were kind of chatting with him and probably advising him of any number of things. But he just didn't have much of a reaction. You know, there wasn't sadness, there wasn't anger as far as he was letting on. So that, and I remember just like with any courtroom when the jury's getting ready to read a verdict, there's just this feeling of, I don't know if tension is the right word, but, you know, everyone's just waiting to hear the answer. So I think it just kind of puts everyone on the edge of their seats.
Rex reflected on the trial that had gotten a murder conviction without a body.
You know, at the time, John McDonough, the prosecutor, and he would, I guess he would probably still say this today, that Ricky Spencer played a really big part in helping him secure that conviction and send Doug Stewart to prison. But there was also a lot of key evidence, physical evidence in that case that really stuck out to me. You know, you had the evidence, the cell phone evidence, where they had gotten the data off of the cell phone towers and a phone that Doug Stewart had used that showed he was in the area of Venus Stewart's parents' house at the time she disappeared. But then there was also the tarp wrapper that Venus Stewart's dad spotted on the property that morning after her disappearance, and the police collected it, and they were able, with that wrapper, to connect it back to the Walmart in Ohio that it had been purchased there, and they also found Doug Stewart's fingerprints on it. And you talk about all of those things. I mean, those are key pieces of evidence that I don't think any or that jury couldn't ignore. And there's also, you know, the way that they were able to connect him to that Walmart in Ohio is because they found the receipt in his truck during a search of his truck. And, you know, one of the things I've always wondered is that had they not found the receipt in his truck during that search, how the case might have gone differently. Not that there would have been a different result necessarily, but that it might have taken longer to get there.
Doug's sentencing was on April 18th, 2011, almost a year after Venus disappeared. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Venus's family hadn't held a proper funeral to say goodbye. They decided to honor her memory with a public ceremony on the 1-year anniversary of her death. Hundreds of people from the community came to the memorial service. In the months and years that followed, here's what's happened to some of the people involved in this case. Ricky pleaded no contest in June 2011 to felony manslaughter and was then sentenced to 1 year in county jail. However, he was released after serving only 8 months in jail, according to the Kalamazoo Gazette.
Given what happened to Venus, her family felt that sentence was grossly inadequate based on what was known of his role in the case. You know, they believed that, you know, Ricky Spencer, because he helped plan this whole thing, at any point prior to Venus's disappearance and murder, could have gone to the police and could have possibly stopped all of this from happening, but he didn't. And I think they held him just as responsible as Doug Stewart.
The young prosecutor, John McDonough, faced controversy later in his career. He was voted out of office, an election he lost after he hit a fence while driving drunk and left the scene of a crash in May 2020. He took a plea deal in 2021 to avoid jail time. And as for Doug Stewart, for years he maintained his innocence when he spoke in interviews or when he reached out directly to the media while he served his life sentence in prison. His attempts to appeal had been unsuccessful in state court. "I did not kill my wife, nor did I conspire to kill her," Doug wrote in a 2011 letter he sent to the Kalamazoo Gazette and the prosecutor's office. "I have and forever do love my wife. Ricky's testimony was completely false. Knowing this, I truly believe that he must know where my wife currently is." But then something changed. Part of it was because of an Xbox. Yes, the same gaming system that helped Doug befriend his accomplice. Doug was promised a new Xbox in prison. In exchange, he would tell police where he buried Venus's body. His family and a detective who never stopped working the case had steadily encouraged Doug to speak out, which could have also influenced his decision to finally confess in 2018.
When you look at interviews that he did in 2018, one of the things that he said was that he did it for his daughters, and he also did it for Venus's mother. So, in the end, I don't know why he did it. I guess if it's true that he did finally do it because he wanted to provide answers to Venus's family and his daughters, then I say that's, good, because they deserved to know that. They deserve to know where she was, and they deserve to be able to give her a proper burial.
And just like Doug said they would, police found Venus's remains in a deep hole in neighboring Kalamazoo County. The final mystery had been solved for Venus's 2 daughters and the rest of her family after 8 long years of wondering and searching. Venus's dad, Larry McComb, hadn't lived to see the day. He died in 2017. Her family put Venus's final resting place next to her father's grave. And that's all for this episode. As always, I'd love to know your thoughts on this case. Let me know by joining the conversation on Instagram @CourtJunkie, by tweeting me @CourtJunkiePod, or by emailing me at podcast@CourtJunkie.com. This episode was researched and written by Gabrielle Russon. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/CourtJunkie. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.